Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Wednesday marks World Food Day, a day dedicated to global action for zero hunger. The United Nations Secretary General took the opportunity to make a call for a world where nutritious food is available and affordable for everyone, everywhere.
World Food Day is a global call for zero hunger, for a world where nutritious food is available and affordable for everyone, everywhere. But today, more than 820 million people do not have enough to eat. And the climate emergency is an increasing threat to food security. Meanwhile, 2 billion men, women and children are overweight or obese. Unhealthy diets present an enormous risk of disease and death. It is unacceptable that hunger is on the rise at a time when the world wastes more than 1 billion tons of food every year. It is time to change how we produce and consume, including to reduce greenhouse emissions. Transforming food systems is crucial for delivering all the Sustainable Development Goals. That is why I hope to convene a Food Systems Summit in 2021 as part of the Decade of Action to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. As a human family, a world free of hunger is our imperative.
Joining us now to speak on food security in Nigeria and how we can meet the demands posed by its threat is Agro Logistics Consultant and Executive Secretary, Agricultural Fresh Produce Growers and Exporters Association of Nigeria, Akin Sawyerr. Good morning and thank you for joining us.
Very good morning to you both. Thank you for having me on your show.
So I'd like to start in Nigeria and Sustainable Development Goal 2, about zero hunger. How close are we to achieving that, considering the fact that our Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Nanono, says that there is no hunger in Nigeria, we have achieved food security? Is that political spin or is it factual?
Well, I think there's an element of spin in it. Having said that, we are not close in any way, in my view, to having the sort of levels of hunger that we see in other places. Having said that, if you listen to the Secretary General just now, he said that it's about having access to nutritious food. In that regard, then we do have an issue. So we do have an issue in terms of giving access to children, to women, and to men to nutritious food. So when you look at the figures he talked about, 820 million people across the world who are effectively at the threat of going hungry or under the threat of going hungry, and then you look conversely at the level of obesity at 2 billion, it's quite a significant gap. And in Nigeria, that rings true.
Let's pick up on nutritious food and actually the regulatory bodies, the recommending bodies in Nigeria. How close do you think we are on actually getting the message out there on what is nutritious, how to make nutritious foods, the standards? I know that there are quite a number. I know the Standards Organization has a ton of standards when it comes to food production, preservation, movement. How is that sort of adding up when it comes to actually making sure that people in Nigeria have access to nutritious food?
Well, I think it's a tough challenge to make sure that people in Nigeria have access to nutritious food. And I think the reason we have the challenge is that a lot of the food sector and food production is informal. So if you look at the difference between what people eat, even in urban areas, it really depends on the socio-economic class that you're in. So if you're at the higher levels, you eat packaged foods where the regulation works effectively. The drivers and the people who serve what I would call the middle and upper middle classes are eating food at the side of the road. I mean, that's not regulated. People who are going and buying food, on street corners, there's no regulation, there's no packaging. There's no effective way of measuring, the content of what they're eating. So we need to be, mindful of that. There are lots of regulations. I think the Standard Organization of Nigeria introduced recently about 820 or so regulations, which effectively only apply to foods that are generally imported, but not the locally sourced, locally provided, affordable food that people have access to. So I think we need to be careful. We just don't have the systems to check what people are eating.
That's quite a gap there. There's a lapse there. But now let's talk about what the UN Secretary General referred to about the climate emergency. In Nigeria, we have flooding, we have erosion. What is the impact of these climate issues on our food security? And also we have another problem, which is security.
Sure. So the impact of it on our food security is obviously when you look at the erosion that you particularly see in the north of the country. What it means is that farmers are suffering. We've seen all the issues we've had with the herdsmen who are having to move their cattle to areas, mainly because the vegetation is being depleted, partly because of insecurity, partly because of insurgency, but also because of what you describe as erosion and deforestation. So we do have these issues where there is an impact on us here. What it's causing is increasing urbanization. What it's causing is increasing displacement of people, both from the security perspective and from the perspective of search for food. So effectively, we are a major victim in this country of that. We're very fortunate in that our climate is such that everything and anything grows here. This is not Europe, this is not Russia, where, only certain times of the year can you produce food. We're very fortunate that, food grows even when you don't want it to. Is it the right food? Is it the right mix? That's another issue. And I think that's partly what the Minister for Agriculture was referring to when he says food is plentiful. Nigeria is one of the only countries I know in the world where you can, bring in, you can have cattle, as household pets, if you like. Maybe not pets, or maybe not pets.
They can be close in proximity.
Yeah,
livestock.
But
you can
the
have
reality
them as
is
livestock.
you don't need to feed them. If I bought 4 or 5 goats tomorrow and left them to roam freely, they would eat. There's food available. Okay, there's edible food available. So we're lucky from that perspective. But there is displacement, and if you look at the insurgency and how it's affected states like Yobe, Adamawa, Borno, it's significant. A lot of displacement, people moving around, and they have to find food. It's as simple as that.
You're in the agro-logistics business. I want to talk to you about actually the movement of our food from place to place. Tundu sort of touched on it a little bit, but that we have a security crisis. And you've also mentioned it a little bit. But in general, just even moving, we also have an infrastructure deficit.
Yeah.
In moving food from place to place, so food can grow everywhere, but different food grows in different places.
Yeah.
How are we getting better, and what are still the obstacles of getting food from point A to B in a timely manner so that there's not so much food being wasted?
Okay, and that's a really good question, and it's a really good point you raised there. The infrastructure deficit is probably the most significant bottleneck in that regard. If I dare to compare what goes on here with what goes on in the United States, for example, the roads in the US are built primarily to move food and food products from the producing areas to the urban areas. They're not really built for people to go to Disneyland. That is an associated benefit. If you cannot predict transit times for the movement of food, if you cannot say that from Ibadan to Lagos or from Kano to Sokoto or from Damaturu to Abeokuta, it's going to take a fixed amount of time within certain limits, then effectively what you get is a lot of spoilage. So let me give you a small example. If we started to look, for example, at crops that need to be exported or produce that needs to be exported, there are scheduled flights that leave the airport in Lagos, say at midday, every day, for Europe. If you need to meet that flight in order to put produce on it that earns you foreign exchange, which you can then put back into your farm, if you have an issue on the highway that delays that truck, you miss the flight. You miss the flight, the food spoils, you lose your contract. So there are certain impacts around that. Access to food is critical. Availability is critical. Timely delivery of food is essential. If you can't do it properly, if we don't get that right, then effectively we lose out, and we are effectively threatening our own food security. So it shouldn't surprise you when I say that the Ministry of Works, who is responsible for providing roads, should be an integral part of what the Ministry of Agriculture is trying to achieve. We can't operate in silos, otherwise everybody loses. And I'll go back and say, the idea of having good roads is to be able to move food from areas of production to areas of consumption. If you don't have the road, or you have a road that's inadequate, then you're really using it to move people around. That isn't really the idea of giving us food security.
Absolutely. So there needs to be that synergy. What are the other players that need to be involved? Because he just, in that short clip that we saw, the UN Secretary General said 1 billion tons of food is wasted. It makes no sense ethically or even economically in a world like this where people are hungry. Who else needs to partner in this sort of supply chain from farm to fork to ensure that wastage is minimized? Okay,
so there are a whole lot of other players that need to be involved in this. If we start at the farm level, okay, at the farm level, you have to produce food to a particular standard. You have to produce it to demand. So if you overproduce, then effectively you're going to get that wastage. Okay, so we need to get some idea as to what the demand looks like so that we can actually produce to that demand to reduce the wastage. We need to get storage facilities put in place at appropriate points. So if you're looking at food distribution anywhere in the world, you have aggregation centers, okay? And in this part of the world where we have smallholder farmers, a smallholder farmer is no good to anybody until he aggregates the food he's producing with another 1,000 or 10,000 other smallholder farmers. We need infrastructure that allows us to aggregate, and that's usually called an aggregation center. Then you've got
Do we have that? Sorry, do we have those?
Well, the government has invested in warehouses.
Okay.
They've invested in silos. I'm not talking about this government. Previous governments have invested in warehousing. They've invested in silos. They've invested in conditioning centers. I'm not sure how much those are being used at the moment, but certainly even if they are, you need road access to them. You need refrigeration. You need people in those buildings who can sort, who can grade, who can package, and who can load onto appropriate transport. So do we have them? We probably have the physical structures. Are they in use? Probably not. Could they be put back into use? Maybe, but maybe more by the private sector. And we have seen over the years private players coming in to take over government infrastructure and turn it around to try and make it work. Do we have it as an organized, systemic part of the value chain? I don't think so at the moment. So those are some of the issues. Along the way, if you're talking about what other bottlenecks might there be, we do have this multiple taxation regime here that is informal. So when I say multiple taxation, trucks are stopped, trucks that are carrying food are stopped to check, why their tires aren't, don't have the right pressure or whatever. And then, all kinds of transactions go on to allow the truck to move on. That's such a euphemism there. Transactions. I want to be a little bit careful because I don't want to be sued for. But you understand my meaning. Every time you stop a truck that's carrying food, you're effectively interrupting the supply chain. Okay, and there's a lot of those stoppages that go on. There are all sorts of agencies that spring up, set up a sudden checkpoint, and that checkpoint can put, food in jeopardy. Essentially, we need to get to the point where we almost treat trucks carrying food like ambulances are treated in other parts of the world. If it's carrying food, then we should have proper labeling to say this is carrying food, and it mustn't be stopped without legitimate reasons. So all those sorts of delays add to the issues of delivering food in the right quality, on time, to the right place. There are other bottlenecks that I could name, but those are some of the key ones that I would want us to, really focus on to begin with. Let's have the right roads. Let's ensure that these trucks or these vehicles can move, and let's make sure that we have storage and grading and sorting and all the other facilities to ensure.
When we come back, we're going to continue to talk about the agriculture ecosystem and value chain with Akin Sawyerr, the Executive Secretary of the Agricultural Fresh Produce Growers and Exporter Association of Nigeria. Stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show. We're still with consultant and executive secretary of the Agricultural Fresh Produce Growers and Exporters Association of Nigeria, Akin Sawyerr. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you for not throwing me out during the break.
Before we went on break, we really focused a lot on the logistics part of and the movement of food and sort of spoilage. I wanted to sort of shift a little bit and talk to you about exporting and also some of the non-oil revenue that the government is looking at, which the agricultural sector is one of the major revenue sources that the country is looking at. How do you see the agricultural ecosystem, especially around entrepreneurship, growing, and has the CBN intervention funds been very helpful in growing the ecosystem?
Okay, let me start off by saying that I'm not a great fan of intervention funds. So maybe I'll sort of
Let's talk about that.
Okay, well, I think that agriculture is a business. And every time you try to turn it into a developmental project, what happens is that when the funds run out, which they sometimes do even within businesses, you're then looking for another intervention fund. And it can be an endless road to nowhere. Okay. So that is my view on that particular subject. And it's a view, and others will have other views, but that is my view. In terms of exports and non-oil revenues, do you want me to address that?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we're missing a trick in this country. And the trick we're missing is very simply this. When it comes to agricultural production, and if I focus, for example, on the fresh produce sector, Nigeria is the largest producer of fresh agricultural produce in sub-Saharan Africa. We're the second, I think, only to Egypt across Africa. When you look at the level of exports in that particular segment, it's very poor. So we have very low levels. And there are very good reasons for that, and I'll allude to some of them in a minute. But that sector offers us a huge amount of opportunity. Because this is an oil-producing country, which means we're quite a rich country in relative terms in Africa, so we're the largest oil producer. We have a lot of money to import finished goods. So we also attract a lot of airplanes, for example, as we do ships. Okay. Generally, what that means is that when the planes come to Nigeria, bring in all the finished goods and all the items that we love to buy, the watches, the shoes, the belts, whatever it is that we like to consume, that vehicle, that aircraft is already paid for to and fro. So there are lots of African countries that cannot afford to have aircraft come to their countries. We can. The irony and the sad thing about us here is that the aircraft generally go back empty. So I can give you an example of one particular airline that comes into Nigeria 6 days a week with a Boeing 767, which has a payload capacity of 55 tons. That aircraft comes into Nigeria, it's full of finished goods. General rule in Africa, by the way, is finished goods in, agricultural produce out. When that aircraft is leaving, they put 60,000 liters of jet fuel in the wings, and it flies back to Europe empty, 6 days a week. And this has been going on for years. Because the farmers and the produce either cannot access that aeroplane because of some of the issues we talked about earlier, or the food standard is not good enough for that produce to be accepted, for example, into Europe. So there is a sort of deficit around how food is produced, us following the general rules of food production to make sure that we meet the safety standards and the quality standards. And even when we do, there's an issue with how we get to the point where that food gets loaded and taken offshore. We can almost export free in terms of transport from this country, but we don't because we're not getting some of the basics right. If you take a country like Ghana or a country like Cameroon, they can't attract the sort of aircraft, for example, that we can attract here. So what they do is they fly their produce into our airport on smaller aircraft and then load it onto the larger aircraft that are here and fly it out to Europe. So maybe because we've become a country that makes money from all the other things that allow us to make money because of the oil, we're all trading in one thing or the other. That's a sector that we're not looking at and other people are taking advantage of.
That is a huge trick to miss. And that's hundreds of billions of dollars just being left on the table. So what do we do about value addition? Because I'm interested. We've interviewed a lady on here before about a chocolatier.
Yes.
I would remember that. But we have a Nigerian cocoa belt, several states producing cocoa, but not the finished product. How do we, because, okay, cocoa exports is worth a lot of money, but the finished product is worth so much more. How do we really start to capitalize?
Well, again, it's really about, first of all, recognizing what you just said, that what are the multiples in addition to that add to the value of exporting either raw or semi-processed or finished. Once we understand what additional revenues or income we can get from doing that, then we can then think about what are the investments we need to make. So I'm going to harp on about something everybody talks about in Nigeria. I'm not going to teach anybody anything new. If you don't have power, if you don't have consistent, regular power, value addition becomes a little bit of a challenge at scale. Okay, you can do anything you want with, your own, your own power or your own generator. But the minute you decide that you want to do something at scale, then you have to have regular, uninterrupted power in any area of adding value. You've also got to have the market. So you've got to have contracts with buyers in other parts of the world who say, if you give me this regularly, consistently at this quality, we will give you a contract for this period of time. If you don't deliver on the contract, they cancel the contract. If you don't deliver on the quality, they cancel the contract. If you don't deliver on any of the promises you've made, they just go to another country who can meet those promises. So there's a lot of trust in cross-border business, which must be maintained in order for you to retain the business. That's even before we start to talk about what is the commercial case, for the buyer retaining or continuing to buy from you. That's an entirely different thing. But the very basics need to be addressed. If we have issues like, and it's not always the private sector, sometimes there are regulations that either cause delays at points of exit or, for a variety of reasons, including security. If we don't have all of that aligned, then effectively, how do we access the £200 billion food market in the UK? We're missing some massive tricks. And, depending on how much of that you want me to go into, I can share with you. So, for example, if you look at the UK, 30 years ago, they introduced a policy to help them deal with obesity and to help them deal with, the rising costs of their health system, where they said, look, our people have to eat 5 portions of fruits and vegetables every day. They had a 5-a-day policy. And essentially, the European palate or the British palate is now at a point where that's all they want to eat. If you look at the British plate, it's full of greens. They now can't meet the production for that themselves. Okay, so effectively, they're looking outwards. And actually, it began to threaten their own currency at a particular point in time because they found that actually their foreign exchange, the amount of foreign exchange they were spending on fresh produce was more than they were happy with. So they changed the policy a little bit and turned it to frozen. We, as I said earlier, are the largest producer of fresh agricultural produce in sub-Saharan Africa. That's an open goal. We've got the aircraft, we've got the land, we've got the ability to produce, we've got the right climate, but we haven't got the roads, we haven't got the standards put in place. Essentially, all we have is lots of parties coming together, creating all these associations to attract intervention funds and all kinds of other things that take us no further forward in terms of actually capitalizing on some of these.
So that brings me to my next question. You are the executive secretary of the Fresh Growers
And exporters.
So what are you doing? Because I just want to, and correct me if I'm wrong, I saw something once whereby there is pineapple being exported from Ghana to Marks and Spencer's directly.
Sure.
So, I'm sitting there going, I see pineapple everywhere in Lagos. Why are we not doing the pineapple to Marks and Spencer? So what is your organization doing? How are you guys changing this paradigm?
Sure. Okay, so firstly, what we're trying to do is educate. So we're trying to get people to understand that the market determines what you can do and how you can do it, because they're the ones that pay. Okay, so we're trying to get producers here to understand that in order for you to meet some of the demand, you have to first of all work together, and secondly, you can't do everything yourself. So you can't produce, sort and grade, package, transport, insure, load. You can't do all of that yourself. So what we're trying to do is say, look, the producer is important, but so are the input providers that input into the producer's activities. And then everybody else along the chain, including the financiers, have to be involved in a seamless operation, almost like a production line in a factory where everybody's got a little segment that they're doing. Invariably, what you find here is that everybody wants to do their own thing. If you look at countries that are skilled or have been very successful in developing export in agriculture, they're not reliant on one or two big companies that are doing it. They're sometimes working with smallholders who come together to be able to deliver. So there's, for example, there's a Danish organization. It's a cooperative actually called Lurpak, and they're in the dairy business. Okay, but they're a cooperative. It's not a company. They've come together and everybody brings their produce together and they finance whatever they need to finance to understand what is required by the market so that they can actually deliver into Marks and Spencer's. The Ghanaians, probably due to Europeans reversing or reverse integrating into Ghana, understand the requirements. The Kenyans are the same. They've got a lot of Dutch who understand exactly what is required in Europe. Over here, it's a little bit more difficult. We have insurgency, we have land grabbing, we have all sorts of issues around trying to invest.
We've only got a few seconds left, so I'm going to find a really short question. Where do you stand on the border closure divide? Are you a fan or a critic?
So look, I have...
10 seconds.
In 10 seconds, okay. So I'm a little bit of a fan of it because I think it will help local production. And, you know, it cannot be an endless thing. But I think those who are investing need to be protected.
There you have it.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much for joining us.